guys, it's Godbars here, the self-proclaimed hip-hop historian, and this is the 21st episode of my series where I grab a vinyl from my collection, talk about why I love it, what influence it had, and what its place is in the grand scheme of hip-hop. So as you can probably tell, I've moved on from modern albums to discuss 5 classic albums from what's most commonly considered the golden era of hip-hop, the 1980s. While I have a decent amount of output from the 1980s, I'm still going to run out before any of the other decades because it's easily the decade with the least hip hop material out there since hip hop's creation, obviously. So, with that in mind, I'm only going to tackle 1980s albums 5 at a time while I do 10 for the other ones. There's dozens of classic hip hop albums from the 80s that are worth talking about, but I wanted to start with some of the most essential ones that really shaped the landscape of the genre. Since I'm only in my mid-20s, I can't look back at the 80s or 90s with personal experience, so I kind of just have to do my own research and listen to people who were there and kind of weigh it for myself. When it comes to the album I'm talking about today, It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back, I don't know if it altered the DNA of how people rap in the way that Paid in Full did, where Rakim practically completely revolutionized how people structure verses. But in terms of content, socio-political presence, and challenging the status quo with passion and music, nobody can deny how important Public Enemy's second album was. While their debut, Yo Bum Rush the Show, came out in '87, it's gained some cult status with fans in retrospect, but it didn't exactly break them onto the scene the way other debuts would. If you listen to a lot of hip hop podcasts or content where you hear old school stories, you may have even heard tale of Public Enemy getting booed and having some pretty rough shows in the early days of their career. It still sold pretty well and undoubtedly showed Chuck's knack for black nationalist political views, but despite assistance from Rick Rubin, the Bomb Squad hadn't quite found the faster, more up-tempo style that many of the anthems off It Takes a Nation would utilize. While there's still some noisy, cluttered aspects to the first album, the beats more resemble the other hip hop coming out in '87, like Criminal Minded by Boogie Down Productions or even Rhyme Pays by Ice-T. But with It Takes a Nation of Millions, they once again recruit Rick Rubin along with Hank Shock Lee to craft an experience that was so ahead of its time and groundbreaking. The only albums in the 1980s that came after it that were as revolutionary that I can think of would be Straight Outta Compton and 3 Feet High and Rising. If you somehow haven't heard of Rick Rubin, he was one of the founders of Def Jam along with Russell Simmons, and his ear for production was an essential tool utilized in many classic albums over the last 40 years. But even by the late 80s, he had already worked with Beastie Boys, Run DMC, LL Cool J, and even Slayer. If you're a bit younger and aren't too familiar with Public Enemy in general, outside of it just being a name you've heard in passing, they were comprised of Chuck D, Flava Flav, Terminator X, Professor Griff, and the rest of the influential production crew, the Bomb Squad. Chuck pretty much has a default spot at any table where the discussion is hip-hop legends who pioneered championing for Afrocentric causes, and in many ways he became the first civil rights leader on wax. At least in hip-hop, obviously you'd have to give a nod to people like Marvin Gaye or Fela Kuti, who were protesting government oppression and injustice in their own respective genres. I often think of the famous story where Marvin Gaye took the title track for What's Going On, one of the most flawless pieces of art in modern times, and when he showed it to the founder of Motown, Berry Gordy, he repeatedly said it was the worst thing he had ever heard. I mean, just think about that for a second. That's someone in that position where he decides what does and doesn't come out, who does and doesn't make it to a degree, and he's at an influential black music label and didn't see the value in music that pointed out oppression and hypocrisy. The argument Marvin used that I have to assume worked, since we ultimately got the song and album, was that Elvis had been singing protest songs, and why should a culture vulture like that, who's barely affected by these issues, be able to speak on them, but I can't when I actually witness the injustice daily? I don't think he said it like that. He didn't call him a culture vulture. He just said, why can Elvis do it but I can't? But I like to imagine what I said is what was going on in his head. I think Chuck resonated with so many black Americans at the time due to his clear but attention-demanding delivery, that was obviously strongly influenced by revolutionary voices like MLK Jr. and Malcolm X. He has that similar sort of tone where it almost sounds like he's delivering a speech. His words are poignant, yet blunt and straightforward enough to make sure everybody understands them while still retaining that fire underneath. Honestly, while Chuck is the lead MC who really drives the lyrical direction of the albums, Flava Flav is pretty solidified as the single best hype man in hip hop. Though I have to give a shout out to Spliff Star because he's definitely the most hardworking hype man, and I've never not seen him elevate a Busta Rhymes performance. But despite the hype man becoming sort of a lost art in post 2000s hip hop, Flava Flav has stayed a notable pop culture icon for over 30 years. You could never have listened to a Public Enemy album or even song, but still be familiar with Flava just from his old reality dating competition show, Flavor of Love. If you're like me, you watched every episode of this show despite it maybe not being exactly top tier television. It most definitely was entertaining, and a lot of the girls in that show became figures in entertainment in their own right, to the point some of them would have their own shows and would be referenced in verses and battle rap bars over the years. It could be slightly confusing hearing about the pro-black socio-political content that went into the music, and then see Flava Flav's massive clock chain, his reality show, and his personal addictions, but I feel like what he brought to Public Enemy was a just as unfiltered approach as Chuck D, maybe even more, but while Chuck's flow is more controlled, collected, and determined, Flava embodied the explosive and more out of control elements of PE. A lot of the time he'll come in to emphasize and enhance what Chuck is saying. Probably the most famous example of this is on the anthem Fight the Power, where Chuck raps, "Elvis was a hero to most, but he never meant shit to me, you see. Straight out racist, that sucker was simple and plain." Then Flava backs him up with "Motherfuck him and John Wayne." While I'm a huge fan of the album the group released after this one, Fear of a Black Planet, I felt it kind of necessary to talk about It Takes a Nation of Millions first, just because it kind of laid the groundwork for this next album to be able to get made. The flows are so infectious and they perfectly match the hectic production, which was as groundbreaking and influential as instrumentals can be. Songs like Bring the Noise, Don't Believe the Hype, and Rebel Without a Pause are instantly recognizable and synonymous with golden age political hip hop. Along those lines, while this is pretty commonly regarded as a perfect album, and I completely agree, my three favorite songs would have to be Don't Believe the Hype, Terminator X to the Edge of Panic, and Black Steel in the Hour of Chaos. I also wanted to give a couple honorable mentions to Louder Than a Bomb, Prophets of Rage, and Night of the Living Bassheads. Thank you for watching my 21st video. The next album I'm going to talk about is insanely important. You could even argue it's just as important as this album, but it's from the opposite coast. So be sure to tune in and see what that is, as well as like, subscribe, and let me know what your favorite moments off this all-time classic are. And don't forget to have a great day, and I'll see you next time, okay? All right.